Welcome to today's class. I want to start off by talking about utilitarianism. And as we go into utilitarianism, I want to point out again that the section that we're in right now of normative ethics is still talking about consequentialism. So one of the first things that we can understand about utilitarianism is that it's going to be focusing on consequences of actions. But it's going to be different than what we've mentioned with egoism or social contract theory. So let's go ahead and have a deeper look here at utilitarianism. First of all, one of the more interesting things that we can mention about utilitarianism is that it was often people give credit to Jeremy Bentham as being the founder of utilitarianism. So it was started by Jeremy Bentham. And an interesting kind of tidbit about Jeremy Bentham is that he requested for the College of London, University of England, to take his body and have it, the skeleton preserved with this kind of waxy figure that you see here, and to be placed in this glass casing so that he could be displayed. And that at the start of every year, he would set the chairman of the board presiding over the meetings that occurred with the other board members. I mean, he did this in order for the college to get his endowment. And up until February of 2020, his body was kept in this glass casement. It's displayed, I believe, like in the student union or something like that now. But it's an interesting kind of a fact about Jeremy Bentham. He's considered to be a pretty jovial soul himself. He has a lot of other writings that are really interesting. One that has gotten a lot of attention in the 20th century is writing on what's called the Panopticon. But the main idea that Bentham proposed is often termed hedonism now. And this is really just the idea that you can't separate pleasure from morality. Ultimately, the main driving force is pleasure, and that when we try and make a decision, putting aside what kind of pleasure it's going to produce for us, from Bentham's standpoint, that's what makes something immoral. And so he proposed this system of hedonic calculus, where he came up with this unit of measure called a hedon. It's one pleasure unit. And basically what he'd say is that you multiply the number of pleasure units by the number of people who are involved in the task. And whatever came out to the highest pleasure principle, that was the one that should be chosen. And of course, there's a lot of ambiguity with that, a lot of problems, because we don't know what a hedon is. We don't know how to assign a unit of pleasure. Is eating a Snickers bar the same unit of pleasure as eating an M&M, candy bar? Right? It's one more incremental than the other. What about people who are allergic to chocolate in general? Right? They don't get the same kind of pleasure out of it. So there's a lot of ambiguity about how do you actually measure that to begin with. But this idea really stuck with Bentham's understudy, John Stuart Mill. And Mill is often seen as the main proponent of utilitarianism. But again, it's worth just reflecting on the fact that before we have a major school of utilitarianism that comes out with Mill, Bentham is a proponent of its kind of precursor and this idea of hedonism. And Bentham, when he argues, often argues it as utilitarianism. So when Mill sees Bentham's idea about pleasure, he gets motivated very quickly to make this argument for utilitarianism. And we'll see there's a couple of arguments that Mill uses that he steals from other people. But this argument is an interesting one, because he ultimately says that if we understand the way the world works, then we have to have this kind of pragmatism about it. And so he starts off by saying if something is audible, right, it's something that we can hear. And if something is visible, it's something that can be seen. So he moves this to the idea about desirability. And he says, well, if something's desirable, then clearly, just like something that is audible is heard and something that's visible is seen, something that's desirable is something that is desired. And so he raises this question about morality and just simply asks, do we desire morality? Right? Is morality something that is desirable? What he comes up with to answer this question starts his argument for the principle of utility. And so he steals an argument from Aristotle here that we'll talk about later. But basically, this is the idea, is that we can look at any series of things that we're choosing in life and ultimately come up with the same reason why we're choosing them if we press it hard enough. So a really kind of clear example is all of us went to elementary school, and as a good 4-year-old might ask, we'd say, well, why? Why did you go to elementary school? You say, well, the reason why I went to elementary school was because I needed to in order to go to middle school. You say, okay, but why? It's like, well, obviously the reason why I went to middle school was so that I could go to high school. And again, like a good 4-year-old would say, yeah, but why? Why did you do that? And say, well, obviously I needed that to go to college. Okay, but why? Well, I need to go to college, right, for a number of different reasons. Become better educated, have more money, get a better job. And again, if we just take this route and we keep asking why over and over again, right? Why do you want to have a better job? Why do you want to have more money? Why do you want to become better educated? We can keep putting down answers that are pointing us in a certain direction. But eventually, for Mill, what he thinks the ultimate answer is, where we arrive at, is that you want to do all of those things because you want to be happy. And when he arrives at this answer, he thinks it's the final answer. The reason why you want to be happy is just simply because you want to be happy. So when we think about that, there's this distinction that's made in ethics between what we call an intrinsic good, that is something that is desired for its own sake, and an extrinsic good, that is something that's desired for the sake of something else. Sometimes it's also called an instrumental good. And so Mill points out that happiness is an intrinsic good. It's something that we desire simply because we desire it. We don't desire happiness for any other reason other than we just want to be happy. Whereas we look at a lot of other things out there, like money, for instance, right? Unless you're like Scrooge McDuck and you're just like swimming around in your big pool of money, you desire money because of what it can get you, right? You desire it for the sake of something else. You desire it because it can buy you a car, or it can get you a house, or it can do any number of those different things. And so Mill, to go back to his earlier question about why we desire morality, ultimately says, well, the reason why we desire morality is because it's an extrinsic good, right? Morality is producing for us the consequence of happiness. And so insofar as a idea or a principle is making us happier, it's good. And insofar as it's not making us happy, then there's some evil to it, right? There's some immoral judgment that's happening. But what's important here is, in Mill's framework, he actually is placing happiness higher than morality. He says the reason why we desire to be virtuous, the reason why we desire to be moral, is because we want our happiness. And so we shouldn't consider any principle of morality more important than we should consider our own happiness, and particularly the happiness of people in general. And so this is what helps Mill create the principle of utility, which basically just states that we are trying to maximize our happiness by minimizing our pain. I should make a little addendum here. The language that Mill actually uses is, he says that we should do the maximum to bring ourselves happiness, and we should minimize those things which cause the opposite of happiness. And so pain isn't necessarily the language that's used there, but it's the opposite of happiness. And a lot of people today, from a utilitarian perspective, look at this as a relationship between happiness and pain. But anytime that you see that kind of superlative language being used, where something is greater, better, more of something else, and something else is lesser, not as important, there's probably a utilitarian argument that's being employed in some fashion there. One thing I want to point out that is beneficial from a utilitarian standpoint is we talked about this paradox of hedonism earlier this semester, right, when we were talking about social contract theory and egoism. And we pointed out the fact that there's this problem that exists when we're trying to chase something that is extremely beneficial for us, when we're trying to go after something. And that is that if we pursue it too much, it ends up becoming a problem for us. In fact, it ends up becoming a detriment towards the thing that we're looking for. And so if you remember what we said, addiction follows this way, where a person who is really, in the beginning, not addicted to, a substance or sugar, someone who isn't really an alcoholic, but they enjoy social drinking, they enjoy the recreational drug use every now and then, they enjoy eating some sugar, right? What eventually can happen to that person is that the dosage that they enjoyed at the beginning needs to increase in order for them to get the same kind of fix. And so they start multiplying and adding just to sustain the same kind of high that they were feeling. And this is true of any kind of pleasure that we could talk about. If you remember the example I gave of the radio contest, where people were drinking water and holding it in to see who could hold their pee the longest, right? They ended up drowning themselves. And so, anything, even something as good and nutritious and important for our life as water, if we take it in excess, it can be a problem for us. And so ultimately here, a lot of Eastern philosophers even kind of point to this phenomenon that if we want happiness, we can't just have it. We have to understand it in connection with happiness's opposite. And another way of thinking about this is, if you could have whatever you felt was the thing that was going to make you happy today, right? Like you needed a bigger house, you wanted 1,000 hours of babysitting, like whatever it may be that would help you settle out at this point of your life right now, and you were granted that. Think about a month after you were granted that, what your life would be like. What would make you happy then? And if there's an answer to that question that shows just how troubling it is to say that there is one thing that can bring us happiness. And so Mill understands this and creates that standard that not only are we maximizing our happiness, but we're also trying to minimize the amount of pain that's done to us at the same time. And one person's happiness shouldn't be at the expense of somebody else's pain. It's something that we should hold together for both of them. Otherwise, we can justify absolutely terrible actions. Right? We could justify slavery. We could say, well, sure, let's have lots of people, right, be enslaved to the majority. There's no end in sight of the terrible things that we could do if we're only mindful of one person's happiness or a group of people's happiness. And so by trying to maximize overall the happiness at the cost of the least pain possible, we're also trying to be mindful of other people and not commit the same problems that occurred in egoism or social contract theory. So there's two versions of utilitarianism, and I think it's important to kind of spell out both of these. And then we'll talk about why people follow them. But one version is what's called act utilitarianism. And this focuses on individual actions themselves, calculates the maximum happiness and minimization of pain for each individual action, and kind of runs this like gambit of, okay, let's let's see if we keep doing this action, what kind of like happiness we would gain from it. And from an act utilitarian standpoint, it's really important that there's kind of a cutoff point towards understanding of our actions. Again, if we go to that idea of the principle of moral uncertainty, which again states that we don't know what our actions are going to produce, we can't possibly calculate every single action and reaction that happens in the universe. And so from an act utilitarian standpoint, because of that, we should evaluate individual actions themselves and look to see whether or not those actions actually produce happiness for people, or whether or not they create kind of pain. And so like if we look at this for a moment, right, the kids eating the gingerbread cookie, assumedly enjoying the gingerbread cookie that's there, and we'd say, okay, right, let's think about this particular action, right? Is it good for this individual to eat the gingerbread cookie or not? We say it looks like the gingerbread cookie is producing a lot of happiness for this person, right? Like let them have it. Now, if we had like 100 gingerbread cookies and they kept eating them and eating them, there's a point at which their stomach would, not feel so good. We'd say, okay, eating this gingerbread cookie is actually starting to cause you pain now. It's starting to be a bad thing. So we need to back off of it, right? We need to stop doing that. And so that's kind of the logic of act utilitarianism. So again, we'll look at the individual action itself and evaluate it from that standard. The other version is what's called rule utilitarianism. And rule utilitarianism says it's not enough for us to just evaluate individual actions, but we have to consider specific rules or specific principles which bring about happiness. And so again, if you remember that picture that I showed of what the traffic looks like in Ethiopia, right, you can remember when everyone's kind of pursuing their own individual interest, there's this problem of like just a massive traffic backup, right? And so again, we follow the rules of the traffic, not because we enjoy stopping at stoplights, but because it would almost be impossible for us to go from one place to the other if there wasn't some kind of traffic system in place. The rules allow us to move more efficiently to where we're going. And that's the same idea in rule utilitarianism, is that by following specific principles, by following specific rules, we ultimately will maximize our happiness and minimize our pain. Again, if we think about the earlier example I just gave here of the person who's eating the cookie, we'd say, on each individual case, like it's okay that person eats that cookie, but what if someone eats a gingerbread cookie every single day? Right? It seems as though that eventually becomes detrimental for your health. It certainly isn't good for your teeth. And from a rule perspective or a principle perspective, we might say the problem there is that you're over the aggregate doing something that's harmful for yourself. And so we create a rule or a principle to try and make sure that we're not damaging our happiness. And kind of like in this illustration here of the Jenga game, on an individual case-by-case basis, you can see that things hold together very well. But it only takes moving one piece, right, doing one action for the rest of the tower to fall down. And so thinking about that, rule utilitarianism just basically says, let's be mindful of the totality of actions and not just individual ones. Let's embrace principles that ultimately help us maximize our happiness and minimize our pain, so that we don't fall into a situation we can't get out of, right? One that ends up bringing us a lot more pain. If you look at both of these, rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism, you might originally also just think of this idea. Is there a distinguishable difference between these two? They're both arguing for the maximization of happiness, the minimization of pain. And there's a clear argument that some people make of just pointing out the fact that individual acts help us create better rules and better principles, and rules and principles themselves are based upon individual actions. And so there's this way in which we could hold both of these positions together simply by saying that they're refining each other. Our individual actions help refine our principles, and our principles themselves hold our individual actions accountable to a larger extent. This is actually a big debate that happens in a lot of different academic disciplines where, like we say, are the principles that are true to the profession the ones that we uphold to, or is it the outlier cases that change those rules that have the bigger kind of sway? One thing I would point out is one of the main reasons why people believe in utilitarianism, right, the big why of the belief in utilitarianism, is because it's an extremely intuitive philosophy for us. On the first day of class, a lot of us, when we were talking about the trolley problem, relied on an argument from utilitarianism. Right? More people will be saved and less people will be harmed if we pull the lever. And so even though it doesn't seem like the best solution, it's still a better solution than any other one that we can come up with. And so we will pull the lever and save the 5 over the 1. Not only is this intuitive, but it's also a little bit easier for us to calculate as well. It's easier for us to kind of look at the damages that can happen versus the benefits that are offered and allow us to make a decision. And we usually feel pretty justified by being able to do that as well. And so we understand both what utilitarianism is, and we also understand some of the reasons why people believe it. Let's look at some of the criticisms really quick about utilitarianism. 3 of the big kind of criticisms I have outlined here is, first of all, we don't always understand what happiness looks like for us versus pain. In fact, there are times when there are things that happen that bring us a lot of happiness. And later on, those same exact things bring us a lot of pain. In class a little bit earlier, I was describing how people who find out that they're pregnant, women who find out that they're pregnant, can get very happy about that pregnancy, and then later on, if they miscarry, right, that same event becomes a very painful experience, and a lot of pain that has to be dealt with. We can think about almost any form of trauma that exists, right, where you have a relationship with somebody and something happens. And so the thoughts of that individual that originally made you feel happier start to bring you a sense of pain. And of course, the reverse is also true. Things that bring us a lot of pain, like when we're able to deal with them or we're able to understand them differently, they can start to bring us happiness as well. And so it's not always clear at the beginning whether or not something is going to maximize our happiness or minimize our pain. And that kind of flows into the second thing that I've got written here, which is there's sometimes when pain is an important part of who we are. And if we could choose in the moment to not have our pain, we would choose for it to go away. And then we would not be the same people who we are. We would, strangely enough, kind of desire to have had that experience, even though it was a very painful experience. I've got written over here, right, on the cartoon, it says, "The end is near," right? And then the other person puts down, "This will never end," right? He looks at the person who has "the end is near," and he's like, "Your optimism disgusts me," right? And what the cartoon's pointing at here is that our perspective of things can change, just like we mentioned at the beginning of the semester. And with that perspective, our happiness and our pain are intimately tied together with that perspective. And so again, things that we originally think are not going to bring us happiness can bring us happiness, and things that we think are going to bring us pain right, can actually relieve us from the feeling of pain. But more importantly, we have to sometimes, just ask ourselves if we could alleviate ourselves of pain, right? Would that be a good thing? Because part of who we are, part of what we do in life, comes from the pain that we felt and our ability to cope and deal with the pain. So again, if we could go back to some situations in our lives and be able to choose against the pain that we feel, we'd say, well, definitely, right? I would not want to feel that way ever again. I wouldn't have wanted to feel it the first time. But who we are comes in large part because of what we've chosen against the pain. And then the last thing that I've got written here, right, is morality truly desirable because of what it produces? This is, to a larger degree, argument we can make against any consequentialist theory, which is, it seems as though if we are desiring morality purely because of what it produces, it seems as though we're keeping morality on a lower pedestal than what we ought to. And so we could say that maybe there are other reasons why people desire morality than simply because it can bring us happiness. Or maybe there's a different standard that exists that makes morality more important than happiness for us. And so again, in utilitarianism, because it is a consequentialist theory, it is looking at the results of our actions and evaluating actions based off of those results. But we might say it's maybe better to evaluate morality not by what it produces, but instead maybe off of one of the other theories that we're looking at, right? What it is, or the relationship that we have with others. So that, in summary, is what utilitarianism is. If you have any questions for me, feel free to send me an email. Have a wonderful day.